The other pilots at Kimbolton Air Base called him Grease Monkey, and Charles Brown had learned to live with it. He was 24 years old in the autumn of 1943, a second lieutenant flying B-17 Flying Fortresses with the 379th Bombardment Group of the 8th Air Force. He'd graduated from pilot training 6 months earlier, received his wings and commission, and been assigned to heavy bombers, despite having spent more time in his training squadron talking to mechanics than to other pilots. Charlie, as his crew called him, had grown up in Weston, West Virginia, the son of a coal miner who died in a collapse when Charlie was 12. His mother had raised 4 boys on a seamstress's wages, and Charlie had learned early that if something broke, you fixed it yourself because you couldn't afford to replace it. By the time he was 16, he could rebuild a car engine, repair a radio, fix a washing machine, diagnose problems in machinery that baffled trained mechanics. He'd enlisted in the Army. Air Forces in 1941, right after Pearl Harbor, expecting to be assigned to maintenance crews. But the recruiters noticed something in his aptitude tests. He had an intuitive understanding of how machines worked, yes, but he also had spatial reasoning skills that suggested he could fly. They sent him to pilot training, where he proved to be technically proficient but unconventional. His instructors noted that he flew by understanding the aircraft's systems rather than by feel. He knew exactly what each engine control did, how the fuel mixture affected combustion, how the turbochargers responded to altitude changes, how the electrical systems distributed power. When other cadets talked about feeling the aircraft, Charlie talked about RPMs, manifold pressure, and cylinder head temperatures. "You fly like a mechanic, Brown," one instructor had said. It wasn't meant as a compliment, but Charlie passed his training, earned his wings, and was assigned to B-17s. The Flying Fortress was the most complex aircraft most pilots had ever encountered. 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines, each producing 200 horsepower, connected to turbochargers, generators, hydraulic pumps, and a maze of fuel, oil, and electrical systems. Most pilots learned the basics and trusted their flight engineers to handle the rest. Charlie learned everything. He spent hours in the hangars at Kimbolton, talking to crew chiefs and mechanics, studying the technical manuals that most pilots never opened, learning the tolerances and limitations of every system. He wanted to know what happened when an engine failed, how to redistribute power, how to compensate for damaged systems, how to keep a crippled aircraft flying when the manual said it should be falling from the sky. The other pilots in his squadron thought this was weird. They flew bombers because bombers were prestigious, because they'd been told the war would be won by strategic bombing, because flying a 4-engine heavy was considered more important than flying a single-seat fighter. They learned enough to pass their check rides and spent their free time drinking in the officers' club, not crawling around maintenance hangars. "Hey, Grease Monkey, you planning to join us for poker tonight, or are you going to sleep in the hangar again?" That from Lieutenant Morrison, a pilot from Connecticut who'd gone to Yale and never let anyone forget it. "Gotta finish reading the engineering manual on the turbocharger system," Charlie said. "Jesus Christ, Brown. You're a pilot, not a mechanic. Let the enlisted men worry about that stuff." "The enlisted men aren't the ones who'll be at 25,000 feet over Germany when something breaks," Charlie said. Morrison laughed. "When something breaks over Germany, you're dead anyway. No amount of manual reading is going to save you from flak or fighters." Charlie didn't argue. He just kept studying. Because he'd noticed something the other pilots seemed to miss. The B-17s came back damaged all the time. Engines shot out, hydraulics failed, electrical systems shorted. And the pilots who understood their aircraft systems, who knew how to work around failures, were the ones who made it home. The pilots who just flew by instinct and hoped the aircraft would hold together were the ones who didn't come back. Charlie's first combat mission was on November 3, 1943. A raid on Wilhelmshaven, a German port city with submarine pens that the 8th Air Force had been trying to destroy for months. His crew was nervous. It was their first mission too. The bombardier, a kid from Ohio named Andy. The navigator, Spencer, who'd been a math teacher before the war. The flight engineer, Blackie, who was the only crew member who appreciated Charlie's mechanical knowledge. The radio operator, the gunners, all of them green, all of them scared. "Listen up," Charlie told them during the pre-flight briefing. "We're going to take hits today. Every mission takes hits, but this aircraft can fly on 3 engines. It can fly on 2 engines if we manage the power correctly. It can fly with hydraulics out, with electrical systems damaged, with holes in the wings. I know every backup system, every workaround, every trick to keep us in the air. Your job is to defend us and hit the target. My job is to get us home. Trust me on that." The mission went smoothly until they reached the initial point, the navigation checkpoint where the bomber formation made its final turn toward the target and the bombardiers took control. At that point, the formation had to fly straight and level, maintaining precise spacing and altitude, while anti-aircraft guns below and fighters above tried to kill them. The flak over Wilhelmshaven was intense. Black puffs of smoke filled the sky, each one representing an 88mm shell exploding with enough force to tear apart an aircraft. Charlie held formation, kept his B-17 steady while Andy called out corrections to the bombing run. Around them, other bombers were taking hits. One aircraft to their left lost an engine, started trailing smoke. Another aircraft ahead took a direct hit to the cockpit and fell out of formation, spiraling down. Then their aircraft shuddered. A flak burst had exploded close enough to send shrapnel through the bomber's right wing. Alarms sounded. The number 3 engine, the inboard engine on the right wing, was losing oil pressure. "Number 3 engine is hit," Blackie called from the flight engineer station. "Oil pressure dropping fast." Charlie's training took over. He didn't panic, didn't freeze. He looked at the gauges, processed the information, made a decision. "Feather number 3, he ordered. "Shut down the engine before it seizes." Blackie hit the feathering button. The propeller on the number 3 engine rotated its blades edge-on to the wind, reducing drag, and the engine shut down. The B-17 yawed slightly to the right. The asymmetric thrust from having an outboard engine running on the left but not the right created an imbalance. Charlie compensated with rudder trim, adjusted the power on the remaining engines to maintain formation speed. They completed the bomb run on 3 engines, dropped their payload, and turned for home. Other crews might have panicked, might have broken formation and tried to race back to England alone. But Charlie knew that leaving formation was suicide. German fighters hunted stragglers mercilessly. Better to stay with the group, accept the slower speed, and make it back together. They made it home. Charlie landed with 3 engines, taxied to their hard stand, and shut down. The ground crew immediately swarmed the aircraft, examining the damage. The crew chief, a master sergeant named Quinn, found Charlie in the debriefing room. "Lieutenant Brown, I looked at your bird. You shut down that engine at exactly the right time. 5 more seconds and it would have seized, probably caught fire. How'd you know?" "Oil pressure was at 35 psi and dropping 5 psi every 3 seconds, Charlie said. "At that rate, you hit critical pressure in about 20 seconds. Engine seizure occurs within 5 seconds of critical pressure. I shut it down at 18 seconds. Quinn stared at him. "You did that math in your head during a bomb run with flak exploding around you?" "It's just numbers. Engine tolerances don't change because you're being shot at." Word spread through the squadron. The new pilot, the one they called Grease Monkey, had saved his aircraft and crew by knowing exactly when to shut down a damaged engine. Some pilots were impressed, others thought it was luck. Morrison said, "Any idiot can count to 20, don't make him a hero." But over the next month, as Charlie flew more missions, a pattern emerged. His aircraft took damage, they all did, but he always seemed to know how to keep flying. An electrical failure? He knew which systems to shut down to preserve power for critical instruments. A hydraulic leak? He knew how to manually operate the landing gear and flaps. A fuel transfer pump failure? He knew how to cross-feed fuel from one wing to another using backup systems most pilots didn't know existed. The crews started requesting to fly with him. They wanted the pilot who understood the aircraft, who could work miracles with damaged systems, who could bring them home when other pilots would have bailed out. On December 20th, 1943, Charlie was assigned to fly his 25th mission, the number required to complete a combat tour and rotate home. The target was Bremen, a major industrial city in northern Germany, heavily defended by both flak and fighters. The intelligence briefing warned that the Luftwaffe had been reinforcing their fighter groups with experienced pilots pulled from the Eastern Front. Expect heavy opposition. Charlie's regular crew was with him. They'd flown every mission together, had developed the kind of trust that only comes from surviving repeated attempts to kill you. They trusted Charlie to get them home. He trusted them to do their jobs. The mission briefing was routine until the weather officer spoke. Gentlemen, there's a cold front moving in over the North Sea. Visibility will be poor on the return flight. Cloud cover from 8,000 to 15,000 feet. You'll be flying on instruments for most of the trip back. That complicated things. Navigation in clouds was difficult, and bomber formations had a tendency to drift apart in poor visibility. But the mission was too important to scrub. Bremen's factories were producing critical components for German U-boats. The bombers would fly. They took off at 0900 hours, formed up over England, and headed east toward Germany. The formation consisted of 24 B-17s from the 3-month bombardment group, escorted by P-47 Thunderbolts that would accompany them as far as their fuel allowed, about halfway to the target. The flight to Bremen was uneventful until they crossed the German border. Then the flak started, and then the fighters appeared. Messerschmitts came in groups of 4, attacking from the front where the B-17's defensive firepower was weakest. German pilots had learned that head-on attacks gave them the best chance of hitting the cockpit or the engines, killing the crew, or crippling the aircraft before the bomber's gunners could bring effective fire to bear. Charlie saw them coming, dark shapes growing larger against the winter sky, their yellow nose markings clearly visible. "Bandits 12 o'clock level," he called over the intercom. "Here they come!" The gunners opened fire. The bombers shook with the recoil of 10 50 caliber machine guns firing simultaneously. The Messerschmitts flew straight through the defensive fire, their own cannon and machine guns hammering at the formation. Tracers crisscrossed the sky. Metal tore. Men died. Charlie held formation, held his course. The bombardier needed a stable platform to aim properly. Personal survival meant nothing if they didn't complete the mission. Around him, other B-17s were taking hits. One bomber's No. 2 engine exploded in flames. Another took cannon rounds through the nose, killing the bombardier and navigator instantly. Then their aircraft shuddered with multiple impacts. Cannon shells walked across their right wing, and suddenly the No. 4 engine, the outboard engine on the right wing, was streaming white smoke. "No. 4 is hit," Blackie called. "Coolant leak, temperature climbing fast." Charlie checked the gauges. Cylinder head temperature was already at 250 degrees Celsius and rising. Normal operating temperature was 200 degrees. At 280 degrees, the engine would seize. "Stand by to feather No. 4, Charlie said, keeping his voice calm. But he didn't shut it down yet. They were still approaching the target, still needed all available power to maintain formation. He watched the temperature gauge climb. 260 degrees, 270 degrees. "Charlie, that engine's going to seize," Blackie said. "Not yet," Charlie said. Bomb run was starting. Andy the bombardier was calling corrections, adjusting their course. They needed steady power, steady altitude. Shutting down an engine now would drop them out of formation. 275 degrees, 278 degrees. The engine was running on borrowed time, its aluminum components expanding with heat, clearances closing, friction increasing. Any second it would lock up. "Bombs away," Andy called. "Feather No. 4, Charlie ordered immediately. Blackie hit the feathering button. The propeller blades rotated. The engine shut down. They'd completed the bomb run, but now they were flying on 3 engines, and they still had to get back to England through 400 miles of German-controlled airspace. The formation turned west, heading for home, but the Messerschmitts weren't done. The German pilots had learned to target damaged bombers, the ones trailing smoke or falling behind formation. Charlie's B-17, with one engine feathered and visible damage to its right wing, was an obvious target. A pair of BF-109s came in from the right side, concentrating their fire on the already damaged wing. More hits, more shrapnel tearing through aluminum skin. And then the No. 3 engine, the inboard engine on the right side, the one they'd feathered on their previous mission, started running rough. "No. 3 losing power," Blackie reported. "I'm showing vibration and pressure fluctuation." Charlie looked at the gauges. No. 3 was still producing power, but inconsistently. The RPM was hunting, surging up and down, which meant either a fuel flow problem or internal mechanical damage. If they shut it down, then they'd be down to 2 engines on the left wing and none on the right. The asymmetric thrust would be nearly impossible to control. But if they kept running it and it failed catastrophically, through a rod, caught fire, exploded, it could damage the remaining engines or set the wing on fire. Standard procedure said to feather any engine that was running rough. But standard procedure assumed you had other engines to work with. Charlie had a different idea, something he'd been thinking about since studying the engine systems manual. Something that would sound insane to any other pilot but might work if he could execute it precisely. The B-17's engines had controllable pitch propellers, which meant the pilot could adjust the blade angle to optimize thrust at different speeds and altitudes. They also had mixture controls that adjusted the fuel-to-air ratio, and they had individual throttles for each engine. Most pilots flew with all 4 engines at the same settings, same throttle, same mixture, same propeller pitch. It was simpler, more stable. But Charlie had learned that you could run the engines at different settings if you compensated properly with rudder and trim. And if you varied the settings rhythmically, you could create a pattern that might confuse an attacking fighter pilot's aim. The Messerschmitts were setting up for another pass. Charlie made a decision. Blackie, I'm going to run number 3 engine at variable power. I need you to watch the temps and pressure. Tell me immediately if anything goes critical. Variable power? What do you mean? I'm going to cycle it. Throttle up, down. Create an asymmetric thrust pattern that changes every few seconds. That's insane. You'll lose control. Only if I can't compensate fast enough. Trust me. The Messerschmitts were closing. Charlie focused on his engine controls. He pulled the throttle for number 3 engine back to idle, then pushed it forward to full power, then back again. The B-17 yawed right as the engine reduced power, then yawed left as it came back. Charlie compensated with rudder, his feet dancing on the pedals, keeping the nose pointed roughly forward despite the constantly changing thrust. The Messerschmitt pilot, lining up his shot, found his target suddenly shifting. The B-17 wasn't flying straight, it was weaving, slightly, unpredictably, its nose moving left and right in a pattern that made deflection shooting nearly impossible. The German pilot fired anyway, but his rounds passed behind the bomber's tail, missing completely. Charlie kept cycling the throttle. Up, down, up, down. The bomber shook with the changing forces. The crew was being thrown around, but they weren't being hit. The second Messerschmitt tried to compensate, tried to lead the weaving target, but the pattern was too irregular. Charlie wasn't flying a simple weave, he was varying the timing, making each throttle change unpredictable. 3 seconds at full power, 2 seconds at idle, 4 seconds at full, 1 second at idle. The mathematics of deflection shooting required the attacker to predict where the target would be when the bullets arrived. But if the target's motion was unpredictable, that prediction became impossible. Charlie was turning his damaged engine into a defensive weapon, using its instability to create motion that couldn't be anticipated. The Messerschmitts broke off, unwilling to waste ammunition on a target that refused to behave predictably. They went looking for easier prey, but Charlie's problems weren't over. The formation was heading into the cloud bank the weather officer had warned about. Visibility dropped to near zero. The bombers spread out, each pilot focused on not hitting the aircraft around them, on maintaining some semblance of formation despite being unable to see more than a few hundred feet. And then they took more hits. Flak bursts erupted around them. The German gunners knew the bomber routes and fired into the clouds, hoping for lucky hits. One burst exploded close enough to pepper Charlie's aircraft with shrapnel. The nose plexiglass shattered. Andy the bombardier screamed. He'd taken shrapnel to his legs and shoulder. The navigator, Spencer, was slumped over his table, unconscious or dead. More alarms. The number 2 engine, one of the 2 remaining functional engines, was losing oil pressure. "Number 2 is hit," Blackie called, his voice tight with panic now. "Oil pressure dropping fast." Charlie checked the gauge. 45 psi and falling. They had maybe 30 seconds before the engine seized. If they lost number 2, they'd be down to 1 functional engine. Number 1, the outboard engine on the left wing. A B-17 could theoretically fly on 1 engine, but only in perfect conditions with no battle damage and a light fuel load. They were shot full of holes, heavy with fuel for the long flight home, and being fired at by every German gun within range. He feathered number 2 engine before it seized. Now, they were flying on number 1 and the damaged, intermittently working number 3. The asymmetric thrust was severe. Charlie had full right rudder applied and the aircraft was still drifting left, the nose wanting to yaw away from the one good engine, and they were losing altitude. With only 1.5 engines producing power, they couldn't maintain 20,000 feet. They started descending, 19,000 feet, 18,000, 17,000. Descending meant leaving the formation, which meant becoming a straggler, which meant becoming a target for any German fighter looking for easy kills. The clouds provided some cover, but they couldn't stay in the clouds forever. Eventually, they'd have to descend below them to navigate, and when they did, they'd be alone and vulnerable. At 12,000 feet, they broke out of the clouds. Below was German countryside, fields and forests and small towns, and above, circling like a shark that had found blood in the water, was a single Messerschmitt Bf 109. The German pilot saw them immediately, a crippled B-17 limping along on minimal power, trailing smoke from two dead engines, clearly struggling to stay airborne. An easy kill. The kind of target that would count toward his ace status without much risk. The Messerschmitt dove, building speed, positioning for a stern attack where he could sit behind the bomber and fire until something vital broke. Charlie's tail gunner, a kid from Michigan named Miller, opened fire, but the B-17's guns were designed for defense against frontal attacks. The tail gun had limited range and limited accuracy against a maneuvering fighter. The Messerschmitt closed to 400 yards, 300 yards. The German pilot was being careful, professional, not rushing the shot. He had all the time in the world. The crippled bomber couldn't outrun him, couldn't outmaneuver him, couldn't do anything but die. Charlie looked at his instruments. Number 1 engine was running at maximum power, temperature and pressure at redline limits. Number 3 engine was barely functioning, cycling between partial power and nothing. Number 2 and number 4 were feathered, useless weight. The hydraulic system was damaged. They'd have to manually lower the landing gear when they reached England, if they reached England. The electrical system was running on batteries because the generators were on the dead engines. By every rational measure, they were finished. The manual said that a B-17 in this condition should be abandoned. The crew should bail out, take their chances as prisoners of war, rather than ride the aircraft into the ground. But Charlie Brown had spent his entire life fixing things that other people said were unfixable. He'd grown up in poverty, working with tools and machines because his family couldn't afford to replace anything that broke. He'd learned that the difference between broken and working was often just understanding the system well enough to find the one thing that still functioned and exploited. He still had 1.5 engines, he still had control surfaces, he still had altitude, and he still had one trick left, the variable thrust maneuver he'd used earlier, but more extreme. "Blackie," Charlie said, "I'm going to shut down number 1 engine for 5 seconds, then restart it. When I do, we're going to drop like a rock. Tell the crew to hold on. Shut down our only good engine? That's suicide. Just trust me." The Messerschmitt was at 200 yards, settling into firing position. Charlie pulled the throttle for number 1 engine to idle and pulled the mixture control to cut off. The engine died. The B-17, already barely flying, immediately nosed down into a dive. The sudden loss of lift and thrust sent them falling. The German pilot, finger on the trigger, suddenly saw his target drop away beneath him. His carefully calculated firing solution evaporated. He pulled up, unwilling to dive after the falling bomber. Diving meant giving up altitude, giving up his energy advantage. He climbed, intending to reposition for another attack. Charlie counted to 5 while the B-17 plummeted, then slammed the throttle and mixture controls forward. The number 1 engine coughed, sputtered, and roared back to life. He pulled back on the yoke, trading what little airspeed they'd gained in the dive for altitude, pulling out at 10,000 feet. They'd dropped 2,000 feet in 5 seconds, but they'd also broken the German pilot's attack. The Messerschmitt pilot circled above them, reassessing. This crippled bomber was behaving strangely. Damaged aircraft didn't perform aggressive maneuvers. They flew straight and level, trying to conserve what little power they had. But this one had just deliberately dove, then recovered. What kind of pilot did that? The German pilot dove again, this time from a different angle. Charlie saw him coming and repeated the maneuver. Killed the engine, dropped, restarted, recovered. The Messerschmitt overshot again. The German pilot was getting frustrated now. This should have been easy, but each time Charlie performed the maneuver, it cost altitude. They were down to 8,000 feet now. Below that, the air was denser, which helped the damaged engines, but also meant they were within range of small arms fire from the ground. And they still had 200 miles to go to reach the English Channel. The Messerschmitt pilot tried a third time, approaching more cautiously, ready for the drop. But Charlie varied the timing. This time he only cut the engine for 3 seconds, then brought it back. The B-17 dropped less, recovered faster. The German pilot still couldn't get a clean shot. And then something unexpected happened. The Messerschmitt pulled up alongside the B-17 about 100 feet away, close enough that Charlie could see the pilot's face clearly. The German pilot was staring at the bomber, at the incredible amount of damage it had sustained. The entire tail section was shredded. The nose was blown out. 2 engines were dead. The fuselage was riddled with holes. By all rights, this aircraft should have fallen from the sky 10 minutes ago. The German pilot was Lieutenant Franz Stigler, though Charlie wouldn't learn his name for another 50 years. Stigler was an experienced ace with 22 confirmed kills. He'd flown against the British over England, against the Soviets on the Eastern Front, against the Americans over Germany. He'd seen hundreds of bombers shot down, had shot down many himself. But he'd also had a commander early in the war who'd told him something that stuck. You are fighter pilots first, last, always. If I ever see or hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself. The code of the fighter pilot: you fought machines, not helpless men. Stigler looked at the B-17 and saw what was essentially a flying wreck full of wounded or dead men struggling to get home. The tail gunner's position was empty. The gunner was either dead or helping the wounded. The waist guns weren't manned. The bomber couldn't defend itself. Shooting it down now would be like shooting men in parachutes. It would be murder, not combat. Franz Stigler made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He pulled closer to the B-17, close enough that Charlie could see him clearly, and he gestured, a hand motion that said, "Land. Land here in Germany." Charlie shook his head. Stigler gestured again, more emphatically. Charlie understood what the German pilot was offering: land now, surrender, save his crew's lives. The offer was probably genuine, but Charlie had made a promise to his crew. He'd told them he would get them home, and he intended to keep that promise. He shook his head again. Stigler stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. He moved his Messerschmitt into a position alongside the bomber, matching its speed, and he stayed there, escorting the crippled B-17 west toward the coast. German anti-aircraft batteries along the route saw the 2 aircraft and held their fire. They assumed the Messerschmitt was shepherding a captured American bomber to an airfield. German fighter pilots who approached saw Stigler's aircraft and assumed he had the kill, stayed away. Stigler was using his presence to shield the bomber from further attacks. Charlie didn't understand what was happening at first. Why wasn't the German shooting? Why was he flying escort? Then it dawned on him. This German pilot, this enemy who could have easily killed them all, was protecting them. They flew together for 20 minutes, crossing from German-held territory toward the occupied Netherlands and the coast beyond. Stigler stayed with them until they reached the North Sea, until Charlie's bomber was over international waters where German fighters were forbidden to pursue. Then Stigler pulled alongside one last time, saluted, and broke away, turning back toward Germany. Charlie saluted back. Then he focused on the only thing that mattered: getting his crew home. They were at 6,000 feet now, barely staying airborne. Number 1 engine was still running but consuming oil at an alarming rate. Number 3 engine had finally died completely, no longer even sputtering. They were flying on 1 engine and sheer determination. The English coast appeared through the haze. Charlie had never been so happy to see the white cliffs of Dover. But their problems weren't over. They'd lost so much altitude that they couldn't reach their home base at Kimbolton. They needed to land at the first available field. "Spencer," Charlie called to the navigator. No response. Spencer was still unconscious, possibly dead. "Blackie, can you navigate?" "I'll try," Blackie said. He came forward from the flight engineer station, looked at the map, checked their position. Seething. There's a base at Seething, maybe 20 miles inland. Can we make it? "We'll make it," Charlie said. They limped toward Seething, losing altitude with every mile. By the time the airfield came into view, they were at 2,000 feet. Charlie called the tower on emergency frequency. "Seething Tower, this is Air Force 379. We are a crippled B-17 with multiple engines out and battle damage, requesting immediate clearance to land." "Air Force 379, you are cleared for immediate landing. Runway 24. Be advised, we're showing you have landing gear still. Retracted." "Roger that. Hydraulics are out. We'll manually lower the gear." Blackie went back to the bomb bay and began hand-cranking the landing gear down. It took 3 minutes of hard physical labor to get the wheels locked into position. By then, they were on final approach, barely maintaining altitude, the single functioning engine screaming at maximum power. Charlie lined up with the runway. He had no flaps. The hydraulic system that controlled them was dead. He had minimal brakes, same problem. He had one engine that was about to fail from oil starvation, and he had a crew that included at least 2 seriously wounded men who needed medical attention immediately. The B-17 touched down hard, bounced, settled. Charlie killed the mixture on number 1 engine. It had done its job, brought them home, and was now on fire from the oil leak. The aircraft rolled down the runway with minimal braking, rolling, finally stopping just 100 feet from the end. Emergency crews surrounded the aircraft immediately. Medics climbed aboard and started treating the wounded. Andy the bombardier was still alive, though he'd lost a lot of blood. Spencer the navigator was dead, killed instantly by the shrapnel that had hit him over Germany. Charlie sat in the pilot's seat, his hands shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. He'd kept his promise. He'd gotten them home, not all of them. Spencer was gone, but the rest had survived a mission that should have killed them all. The base commander at Seething came out to look at the aircraft personally. He walked around the B-17 counting holes. He stopped counting at 200. He looked at the 2 feathered engines on the right wing, the destroyed tail section, the shattered nose, the fire-damaged number 1 engine that was still smoking. "Lieutenant Brown," the commander said, "how in the hell did you fly this thing back to England?" "I know the system, sir. I know what's essential and what's redundant. And I know how much abuse these engines can take before they fail completely." "You're saying you calculated this? You knew exactly how far you could push everything?" "Yes, sir. I've been reading the technical manuals." The commander shook his head. "Son, the manual says this aircraft shouldn't fly with this much damage. The manual says you should have bailed out." "The manual doesn't account for variable thrust asymmetry compensation or deliberate engine restart cycles during emergency descent maneuvers, sir." "I have no idea what you just said." "It means I used the broken engines to create unpredictable flight paths that the German fighters couldn't target accurately, and I used controlled engine shutdowns to break their attack geometry." The commander stared at him. "You turned engine failures into a defensive tactic?" "Yes, sir." Over the next week, Charlie's mission was analyzed by tactical officers at 8th Air Force Headquarters. They interviewed him extensively about his techniques, the variable thrust cycling, the deliberate engine shutdown maneuvers, the way he'd used damage as an advantage rather than a liability. Some thought he was reckless, others thought he was brilliant. What nobody disputed was that he'd brought his crew home against impossible odds, and he'd done it by understanding his aircraft better than anyone thought necessary, by reading manuals that other pilots ignored, by being the grease monkey that other pilots mocked. The techniques Charlie developed were quietly incorporated into training programs. Pilots were taught that variable engine power could create evasive maneuvers when normal control surfaces were damaged. They were taught that understanding system limitations meant you could push beyond what the manual said was safe, if you knew exactly how far to push. Charlie flew 12 more missions before completing his combat tour. Every mission, other crews requested him as lead pilot. They wanted the mechanic who could fix anything, who could fly anything, who could bring them home when standard procedures failed. After the war, Charlie struggled with what had happened over Germany. He thought constantly about the German pilot who'd escorted them to safety instead of shooting them down. He wanted to find this man, to thank him, to understand why an enemy would show such mercy. It took 46 years. In 1989, Charlie read an article about former Luftwaffe pilots and decided to search for the man who'd saved his life. Through a series of letters and inquiries, he eventually found Franz Stigler, living in Canada. They met in 1990, 2 old men, former enemies, embracing like brothers. Franz explained his decision. "I didn't have you in my sights. I had you in my heart. You were in a bad way. I could not have shot at you. It would have been murder." Charlie asked Franz if he'd been punished for letting an enemy bomber escape. Franz shook his head. "I never told anyone. If my commanding officer had known, I would have been court-martialed and shot, but I could not shoot you, not like that." They became close friends, the American bomber pilot and the German fighter ace. They spoke at schools together, telling the story of their encounter, teaching young people that even in war, humanity could survive. They appeared in documentaries, wrote a book together, became symbols of reconciliation. Franz Stigler died in 2008. Charlie Brown died in 2008 as well, just months later. They were buried thousands of miles apart, but their story lived on. The engine shutdown maneuver Charlie had developed, deliberately killing and restarting engines to create unpredictable motion, was studied by aerospace engineers designing modern aircraft escape and evasion systems. The principle of using mechanical failure as a tactical advantage influenced how pilots were trained to handle emergencies, but the real legacy wasn't tactical. It was about two men who exemplified different kinds of courage. Charlie Brown, who refused to give up, who used his knowledge of machinery to overcome impossible odds, who kept his promise to bring his crew home. And Franz Stigler, who chose mercy over a kill, who risked his own life to save his enemy, who understood that some things mattered more than victory. The other pilots at Kim Bolton had called Charlie Grease Monkey because he spent his time studying manuals instead of drinking in the officers' club. They'd mocked him for caring about engine specifications and system redundancies. They'd thought his mechanical obsession was weird, unseemly, beneath the dignity of a pilot. And then that mechanical knowledge saved 11 lives. It brought a shattered bomber home across 400 miles of hostile territory. It turned engine failures into weapons, damage into advantage, knowledge into survival. They'd mocked the mechanic pilot, until his engine tricks saved his crew, until his understanding of systems became the difference between life and death, until the grease monkey they'd dismissed became the pilot everyone wanted to fly with. That's the story of Charlie Brown, not just the bomber pilot who survived impossible damage, not just the American who was saved by a German enemy, but the mechanic who read the manuals, who understood the machines, who proved that knowledge was just as important as courage. He couldn't outfight the Luftwaffe, he couldn't outrun the flak, but he could outthink the systems, understand the tolerances, push the limits precisely because he knew exactly where those limits were. They called him Grease Monkey. He saved 11 lives. And in doing so, he changed how pilots understood their aircraft, not as machines to be flown by instinct, but as systems to be understood, exploited, and trusted even when everything seemed broken.